Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Millennial Revolt, an independent political talk show that seeks to bring a different narrative than the stale one we have going on right now in the mainstream media. So, today we are going to be talking about President elect Donald Trump's cabinet positions and who he's appointing and why I think this could be very worrying. Some of the people who are being floated around and some of the people have actually appointed or has announced he has appointed. So let's just get right into this because there's so much to discuss. So the first person who was announced was Reince Priebus. He was announced as Chief of Staff for Donald J. Trump in his new cabinet. Now, I think this is a good pick. I think it was a smart pick for Donald Trump. The reason why I say this is because Reince Priebus is an establishment candidate. Now, even though Donald J. Trump's campaign was the change campaign in this election, I don't think he's going back on any of his promises he made to his supporters. And the reason why I say this is because Reince Priebus has connections with a lot of the Republican establishment who are possibly wary of Donald Trump as president, and he has a very close friendship with Paul Ryan, who is the Speaker of the House. Now, Reince Priebus was also the RNC chairperson for a good number of years. They was said that he was going to easily win re-election, and I think this was a very smart choice for him. I think he has to be able to show that he is willing to take some establishment candidates to, I think, try to appease some of the people in his party who still don't want to recognize him as the president but are just jumping on board. So I think this is a good way for him to solidify his base. It has been floated around that Paul Ryan as well as Donald Trump's children were heavily backing Reince Priebus to be picked for the nomination, and it looks like that lobbying has paid off with the choice of Reince Priebus. Reince Priebus was chosen over Steve Bannon, who is mostly known for Breitbart, but is also a very controversial figure. He is also seen as uncompromising, and he was also selected over Jared Kushner, who is President-elect Trump's son-in-law, but he has no experience in politics. The next person who was announced in Donald J. Trump's cabinet was Steve Bannon. Now, Steve Bannon is a very controversial choice because many people associate Breitbart with the alt-right, and many people call Steve Bannon a white nationalist. Now, Steve Bannon will serve as chief strategist and senior counsel. It should be noted that neither Reince Priebus nor Steve Bannon has ever served in government before. Reince Priebus previously held a variety of party posts within the RNC, but he has never held a position in government before. With the choice and appointment of Steve Bannon, it is seen by some that Trump is unwilling to relinquish some of the brash tactics that got him elected in the first place. So it's to be determined if there will be any blowback from Donald Trump bringing Steve Bannon into his cabinet from more mainstream conservatives, but it should be noted that Steve Bannon helped Donald Trump get his stunning electoral victory as far as the mainstream media is concerned, but many people associate Breitbart, the political website. It has been accused of being anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, and alt-right. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the outlet has undergone a noticeable shift towards embracing ideas on the extreme fringe of the conservative right. Racist ideas such as anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant ideas, all key tenets making up an emerging racist ideology known as the alt-right. Steve Bannon was seen as being behind some of the Trump's campaign's most brashest moves, like bringing former President Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton's accusers to the presidential debate and heading to the U.S.-Mexico border. After Paul Ryan was elected House Speaker, Bannon was quoted in a leaked email obtained by The Hill as saying, "Long game is him, gone by spring." Also spotted at Trump Tower was RNC official Sean Spicer, in another indication of the previous pick. Trump is taking counsel of many people. I think he can't go wrong with the decision, said his campaign manager Kellyanne Conway, who herself has been mentioned for a number of prominent roles, speaking to reporters at Trump Towers before Trump's transition, made the announcement. President-elect Trump is going to want to be very careful with who he chooses to be in his cabinet. He doesn't want to alienate people who may be afraid because he has been elected. As you know, there are still protests going on throughout the country, though I do think some of these people are paid protesters. But nevertheless, he wants to tread carefully. He wants to show a sign of him being inclusive. He wants to show a sign, I think, of listening to what his supporters have to say, but he has to have a balance of being able to work with the Republican establishment as well as appeasing his base as well, and still trying to show that he wants to be inclusive and he doesn't want to alienate anyone who on the left as well. So it's a very thin line he has to walk, but I do think he can do it. I do think he will have a very inclusive and open cabinet. So what does the White House Chief of Staff specifically do? Now, the White House Chief of Staff manages the work and personnel of the West Wing, steering the president's agenda and tending to important relationships. The role will take an outsized importance because President-elect Trump has no experience in policy making and has little in the way of connections with the key players in Washington. That's why I think that Reince Priebus was an important choice because, as I said, he has important relationships with many members who are in Congress as well. He is very close friends with Paul Ryan. So those are just the two people who have been officially announced in positions in the Donald Trump White House. Now I'm going to tell you the people who are on the short list to be in Donald Trump's cabinet. Now for the Secretary of State, some of the people who have been announced are John R. Bolton, who is the former United States ambassador to the United Nations under former President George W. Bush. Bob Corker, who is a senator from Tennessee and chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Newt Gingrich, who is the former Speaker of the House. Zalma Khalid, who is a former United States ambassador to Afghanistan. And Stanley A. McChrystal, who is a former senior military commander in Afghanistan. And it's extremely important who Donald Trump chooses to be his Secretary of State is because, one, he has been against and railing against globalism, and two, he wants to have a more inclusive foreign policy where we have better relationships with Russia, where the United States isn't using our military to engage in conflicts we should not be involved in. So he needs to pick the right person to set the tone in the foreign policy he wants to build. He also has called NATO a relic of the past, which I think it should have been dismantled when the Soviet Union fell apart because NATO is doing nothing but destabilizing many parts of the world as well. So I think it's extremely important who he picks, and he doesn't pick a neocon to represent us on the world stage. Now, the next is Treasury Secretary. The Treasury Secretary will be responsible for government borrowing and financial markets, assisting in any rewrites of the tax code, and overseeing the Internal Revenue Service. The Treasury Department also carries out and lifts financial sanctions against foreign enemies. Now, some of the people who have been nominated is Thomas Barak Jr., who is the founder, chairman, and executive chairman of Colony Capital, a private equity and real estate investor. Jeb Herscheling, who is a representative from Texas and chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. Stephen McMunnin, a former Goldman Sachs executive and Trump's campaign finance chairman. And Tim Pawlenty, a former Minnesota governor. I think Donald Trump should also put in Ron Paul to put in the Treasury Secretary because what you have right now is Donald Trump, who was railing against some of these crooks, the crooks on Wall Street, the big banks, these kind of people. You are putting these exact same people to be in positions of power within the Treasury Department. So I think he has to be very smart who he picks about this. I hope if he's listening to any of his supporters, a lot of people are really supportive of the idea of putting Ron Paul as Treasury Secretary, and I hope somebody floats that idea to him. As far as Defense Secretary is the incoming secretary who will shape the fight against the Islamic State while overseeing a military that is struggling to put in place two Obama era initiatives, integrating women into the combat roles and allowing transgender people to serve openly. Kelly Ayotte has been named for this role. She lost her race in New Hampshire and she was a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Lieutenant General Michael T. Flynn, a former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, he would need a waiver from Congress because of the 7-year rule for retired officers. Stephen J. Hadley, a national security advisor under President George W. Bush. John Cowell, who is a former senator from Arizona, and Jeff Sessions, who's a senator from Alabama, who was prominent in Donald J. Trump's immigration bill. Donald Trump has to be very smart and tread carefully about who he picks to be his defense secretary, because if he chooses a neocon, given what he has said about reducing America's role overseas, as far as getting involved in a lot of these military conflicts, improving relationships with Russia, reducing NATO, having a lot of our allies pay their fair share. There's a lot of neocons within the Republican Party as well as neoliberals in the Democratic Party. Now, he has to pick a person who is willing to support his foreign policy agenda. If he chooses a neocon who is going to undermine what he says, it will cause a lot of problems in the foreseeable future. Now, Attorney General. The Attorney General is the nation's top law enforcement who will help the authority for carrying out Mr. Trump's law and order platform, including his threat to prosecute Hillary Clinton. The nominee can change how civil rights laws are enforced. Governor Chris Christie from New Jersey, Rudy W. Giuliani, who is the former mayor of New York, and Jeff Sessions, now who is from Alabama. Now, the reason why I think Chris Christie will be out of the running is because he has the Bridgegate scandal going on in New Jersey. Rudy Giuliani may possibly get it. He may possibly get it because he has been a hardened Trump supporter throughout this whole campaign, but he is also very controversial in his enforcement and wanting to bring back stop and frisk, which, as I said, as an African American woman who has 2 brothers, it's very scary to try to think of something like that being put on a nationwide level. I think that should be something that, if they are going to do it, even though it was ruled unconstitutional, if they were going to do it, it should be left up to the states. Jeff Sessions, I don't have a problem with Jeff Sessions. I think he would make a good attorney general. Another person who would make a good attorney general is Trey Gowdy. They should nominate him as well. Interior Secretary. The Interior Department manages the nation's public lands and water. The next secretary will decide the fate of the Obama-era rules that stop public land development, curb the exploration of oil, coal, and gas, and promote wind and solar power on public lands. I also think that the Trump administration is going to have to do something about the DAPL pipeline, which is breaking treaties that we had with the Native Americans. So the people who are nominated is Jan Brewer, who is the former Arizona governor, Robert E. Garrity, who is a Guyfin Investors partner, Harold G. Hammond, who is the chief executive of the Continental Resources and Oil and Gas Company, Forrest Lucas, who's the president of Lucas Oil Products, which manufactures automotive lubricants, additives, and greases, and Sarah Palin, who is the former Alaskan governor. I think if Donald Trump wants to make people think that he is serious, take Sarah Palin off of the list. Just just the optics of that alone is just horrible. Sarah Palin, she's kind of an idiot. Just the things that she said during the 2008 presidential campaign, you cannot take it back. And what she has said throughout the years and the way she has conducted herself is just all over the place. So I would truly take her off the list. Agriculture Secretary. The Agriculture Secretary oversees America's farming industry, inspects food quality, and provides income-based food assistance. The department also helps develop international markets for American products, giving the next secretary partial responsibility to carry out Mr. Trump's position on trade. Sam Brownback, who is Kansas governor, Chuck Connor, who is the chief executive officer of the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives, Sid Miller, who is the Texas Agriculture Commissioner, and Sonny Perdue, who is a former Georgia governor. Now, Commerce Secretary. The Commerce Department has been a perennial target for budget cuts, but the Secretary oversees a diverse portfolio, including the Census, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Governor Chris Christie is being nominated for this position. Dan DeMicco, the former chief executive of Nucor Corporation and Steel Production Company, and Louis M. Eisenberg, private equity chief for Granite Capital International Group. Labor Secretary. The Labor Secretary enforces rules that protect the nation's workers, distributes benefits of the unemployed, and publishes economic data like the monthly jobs report. The new secretary will be in charge of keeping Mr. Trump's promises to dismantle many of the Obama errors, covering the vast workforce of federal contractors. Victoria A. Lipnick, Equal Employment Opportunity Commissioner and Workforce Policy Counsel to the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. The Health and Human Services Secretary. The Secretary will help Mr. Trump achieve one of his central campaign promises was to repeal and replace the ACA, which is the Affordable Care Act, or known as Obamacare. The department approves new drugs, regulates the food supplies, and operates biomedical research, and runs Medicare and Medicaid, which insures more than 100 million people. Dr. Ben Carson, which is a former neurosurgeon and 2016 presidential candidate, I think he would be the ideal choice, reason being he was a doctor to begin with, he is a surgeon. Mike Huckabee, which is former Arkansas governor and 2016 presidential candidate. Bobby Jindal, former Louisiana governor who served as secretary of the Louisiana Department of Health and Hospitals. And Rick Scott, Florida governor and former chief executive of the large hospital chain. I think if he was smart, he would take away a lot of these governors, because it seemed like he has a lot of governors on his list, but that's just me. Energy Secretary. Despite its name, the primary preview of the Energy Department is to protect and manage the nation's arsenal of nuclear weapons. James L. Connaughton, apologies for pronouncing his last name wrong, Chief Executive of the NatLuse Data Technologies and former environmental advisor to former President George W. Bush. Robert E. Grady, who is the Giffen Investors Partner, and Harold G. Hammond, who is the Chief Executive of the Continental Resources and Oil and Gas Company. Education Secretary. Mr. Trump says he wants to drastically shrink the educational department and shift responsibilities for curriculum research, development, and education aid to state and local governments. Dr. Ben Carson, who is nominated for this as well, and Williamson M. Evers, who is an education expert at the Hoover Institute, which is a think tank. Secretary of Veteran Affairs. The Secretary will face a task of improving the image of the department. Mr. Trump has widely criticized, repeatedly argued that the Obama administration neglected the country's veterans, and he has said that improving their care would be one of his top priorities. The only person who is nominated for that is Jeff Miller, who is a retired chairman of the House Veterans Affairs Committee. Now the next is Homeland Security. The Hodgepodge agency, which was formed after September 11, 2000 attacks, has one key role in the Trump administration, which would be to guard the United States borders. Mr. Trump makes good on his promises of widespread deportations and building this wall. This secretary will have to carry them out. Now, Joe Aparicio, the departing sheriff of Marquio County, Arizona, David A. Clark Jr., the Milwaukee County Sheriff, Michael McCall, representative from Texas and chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, and Jeff Sessions, a senator from Alabama. Who I would appoint for this position, I would appoint David A. Clark. I like some of the speeches that he makes. I think he came out very strongly after a lot of the riots that we've seen that happened in Milwaukee. I think he will be a good choice. Or maybe Jeff Sessions. Jeff Sessions will make a good choice, but he has been very controversial in his immigration policies that were talking about deporting 11 million people. The EPA administrator, the Environmental Protection Agency, which issues and oversees environmental regulations, is under threat from the president-elect, who has vowed to dismantle the agency in almost every form. The three people who are nominated is Myron Ebel, a director at the Competitive Enterprise Institute and a prominent climate change skeptic. That's not good. Robert E. Grady, Giffen Investors partner who was involved in drafting the Clean Air Act amendments of the 1990s. Jeffrey R. Homestead, a lawyer with Bracewell LLP and former deputy EPA administrator in former President George W. Bush's administration. Now, the U.S. Trade Representative, the president's chief trade negotiator, will have the odd role of opposing new trade deals, trying to rewrite old ones, and bolstering the enforcement of what Mr. Trump sees as an unfair trade deal, especially with China. The only person who is nominated for this is Dan DiMicchio, the former chief executive of Nucor Corporation, a steel production company, and a critic of the Chinese trade practices. The UN ambassador, the second to the Secretary of State, the United States ambassador to the United Nations, will be the primary face of America to the world, representing the country's interests at the Security Council on a host of issues from the Middle East peace to nuclear proliferation. Kelly Ayotte, who has lost her Senate race in New Hampshire, she was also a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Richard Greenell, who is a former spokesman of the United States ambassador to the United Nations during the George W. Bush administration. It seems like he has a lot of people from the George Bush administration, which is not good. We've seen how his administration turned out, and if Donald Trump ever wants to think about re-election in 2020, he is going to have to think very carefully and choose very wisely in a lot of these positions, especially on foreign policy, because we are still in the George Bush wars for oil that he created 16 years ago. The CIA director/director of national intelligence, Mr. Trump takes over at a time of diverse and complex threats to American security. The new CIA director will have to decide whether to undo the CIA modernization plan put into place by Director John O. Brennan and how to proceed if the president-elect orders a resumption of harsh interrogation tactics, which critics have described as torture. So people nominated are Michael T. Flynn, the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Peter Hoekstra, a former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Mike Rogers, former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, and Francis Townsend, former Homeland Security advisor under George W. Bush. You see, he has a lot of people from George W. Bush, and the problem is that Mike Pence took over his transition team, and this is what you have. This does not look good. And the last but not least, National Security Advisor. The National Security Advisor, although not a member of the cabinet, is a critical gatekeeper for policy proposals from the State Department, the Pentagon, and other agencies, a function that takes on more importance given Mr. Trump's lack of experience in elective office. And Michael T. Flynn, who is the former director of Defense Intelligence Agency. Now, it seems that he has a lot of people from the George Bush era, a lot of these neocons, and the problem is if you let these people into his administration, given the fact that he has no experience, you're going to have the same bullshit that occurred 16 years ago with these unnecessary wars. Our relationship is not going to get better with Russia. We're going to keep encroaching. NATO's going to keep encroaching on their borders. We're not going to be able to start non-proliferation and get rid of a lot of our nuclear weapons. I was very hopeful with, I like some of the people who has been announced, but some of these other people just are really rubbing me the wrong way. So I'm going to keep you guys updated on who he selects for each of these positions. I'm just giving you guys the short list and some of the people who have already been announced. I'm the Millennial Revolt. Thank you guys so much for watching, and you have a wonderful day. Bye.